Right, good afternoon, gentlefolk. I'd like to give you all a very warm welcome this afternoon. Warm welcome on perhaps an uncharacteristically warm day at the moment. So it's good to see you here. My name is Howard Greenman. I chair the Strategic Planning Committee and will be presiding over this meeting today. The first question I want to ask is whether you can all hear me okay, such are the vagaries of our IT system. It does appear to drop. Thank you, Christopher. Yes, please do. Yes, please make sure the members are all okay. And at the back there, you can hear everything all right? That's good. Yes. Right, okay. I was just talking about the vagaries of IT, and we've seen that already. I should be ably assisted by the committee that you see in front of you here today, and Tara, Democratic Services, on my left, Linda on my right, our case officer, and to her right, we have Head of Development Services, Chief Planner, and legal team, all keeping a beady eye on how things are done today. It is my hope that we don't need to be refereed in any way, but it's good to have them here. And good to have you here too. I can ask all the devices are turned off. We have enough problems with our IT situation as it is without devices interfering. So either turned off or to silent, please. And I just want to point out that the access into the chamber are the two exit points should there be a fire alarm. There's nothing arranged for this afternoon, so if there is a fire alarm, I think we need to take it seriously. And just to point out, this meeting has been recorded. It is live streamed, as all the Strategic Planning Committee meetings are these days. So I'd ask you to be respectful and mindful of that fact too. So we're now going to take us into the start of the meeting. We're going to start the meeting with apologies. Good to see you come in, Sarah. I nearly tendered your apologies on your behalf. Good to have you with us. We do have apologies from Councillor Elizabeth Threlfall, Buff, who's being substituted by Councillor Richard Britton. It's good to have you with us today. Thank you for coming along. Good to have you. So members, you have the minutes in front of you. We've already had one omission pointed out to us by somebody who clearly reads the minutes very closely. I thought we'd covered all the bases, but I know there were a couple of spelling mistakes, one in Francis Morland's name and a couple of other things. They've been sorted, but as has just been pointed out to me, I think we omitted to point out that Councillor James Shepherd tendered his apologies last time, didn't you? And they're not minuted, are they? We'd better do that then, because that's only fair, right and proper. Adrian pointed that out on your behalf, so thank you, Adrian, thank you, Councillor, for that. Apart from that, given the minutes as you've seen them now, are you all comfortable with the minutes as they are? Okay, that's good. I've got two lots to sign, actually, as it turns out this time, because of the extraordinary meeting we had last month. So I will sign them all at the end of the meeting. Declarations of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest to this one? No, I didn't think we probably would. Thank you. Chairman's announcements. Although I haven't anything written down here, I want to point out to members and substitutes only that at the end of this meeting, there'll probably be a 5 or 10 minute gap to enable members of the public to leave and for other people to sort of reorganise themselves. But we will have a training session on the 5-year housing land supply, being brought up to date with the mechanics and the dynamics surrounding that. That's been something that Adrian has brought up a number of times in the past. So we are aiming to have that this afternoon, as it's a shorter agenda than we sometimes have. So I would ask, even urge you to be here for that meeting. And of course, as I say, it's open to substitutes too, which would include Richard if he's able to. And of course, actually, it includes our unitary member who's here to represent the case today, George Jeans. He's a substitute also, so it'd be good to have him at that meeting too, if he wishes. So apart from that, there are no other chairman's announcements. Now, for the benefit of you all, and perhaps the reminder of the committee, I just want to run through public participation. I'm going to summarise how the item is to be determined, how it will be debated, and how the public participation will work. If it's unclear at any point, please do put a hand up and I'll try and clarify what I'm saying. So in a few minutes, I'm going to hand over to Linda, the planning officer, the case officer in this case, who will present her report and explain her recommendation. She may, if she deems it expedient, ask for other officers' input too. I will then ask members of the committee to indicate if they have any technical questions they wish to ask of the officers. These matters can be quite complex, and it's quite understandable if technical questions do need to be raised. And then I shall proceed to public participation. Typically, it's up to 3 objectors and 3 supporters. We've just got the 1 supporter this time. And typically, I'll give you 3 minutes each. Now, that said, I generally give a little bit of slack on this because what I don't want is any of you to leave the chamber feeling something could have been said and hasn't been said. And we have only got the 1 case today. So I will be giving you a little bit of latitude. But if you see me doing this, that means that I'm trying to wind you up, wrap you up, without being too harsh or caustic about it. So you understand what I'm saying. Thank you. Following the public slots for objectors and supporters, there are slots then for statutory consultees. Then we will hear from up to 3 affected parish councils. I think we just have the 1, maybe 2 today for up to 4 minutes. Again, I should give a bit of latitude on that one. After the parish councils, I will then invite the local unitary member, Councillor George Jeans, good to see him today, from the application to speak. And at that point, I will then open the item to debate. I will ask the first committee member to speak to move the motion. We won't be moving to debate without there being a motion put forward, and I will expect that motion to be seconded at that point. At the conclusion of that debate, I will then proceed to a vote. Is that all clear? You all comfortable with that process? Right, okay, thank you. On to item number 6. Before I hand over to Linda, I just want to bring to your attention, I'm talking to the committee predominantly here, the planning's appeals and updates. You'll have seen that in your report pack. I'm not entirely comfortable with all those. I suspect you're not either, but they're there nonetheless. So you've all seen those. No questions on that. Oh, Pip, I did wonder. Yes, Councillor Bidette.
Is there any further update from the hearing for the land off Melksham Road at Holt? Do we know how the hearing went?
That hearing hasn't been held yet. So on the Holt one, that's just in there to tell you it's coming up.
Sorry, 23rd of February. Holt, not the Holt one, Pippin, I think.
That's the start date of the appeal.
Yeah.
So that started the process. The hearing is in June.
The hearing is actually on the 13th of June. It's a 1-day hearing. Yeah. All right, okay, thank you. Carol.
Just wondering if we've had any cost details about the incinerator.
That's an interesting question. I suspect possibly not. Have we yet, Andrew?
We have received information now from the applicant, and that's with the legal team, and we will be instructing a cost analyzer to look into it and see whether it's correct. So there's no confirmed figure at this stage.
Well, I suspect, Councillor Keane, that's not in the public domain at the moment, let alone ours. But thank you for asking the question. Councillor Newbury, Christopher.
Well, leading on from that question, I mean, presumably the amount they're asking for, we know, and can we have a rough indication of how much they're asking for?
You certainly can. The situation is, before I give you any numbers, is that they've presented us with a total costs figure, but no justification, no explanation, just a total cost figure. And then they presented us with a 25% expectation for us to pay for those costs, but again, without any detail or explanation. And that's my hesitation to share the information, but the figure, in very round terms, the figure for their total costs they are suggesting is 400k. That's their total costs. But as I say, there's no justification.
Sorry, how many 100k?
400.
400k.
Yeah. But there's no justification or explanation with it, and we need that before we can even think about agreeing a partial rewards cost figure.
Well, Chairman, clearly we will rely on leading counsel's advice. And as I read the papers, it struck me that that is a completely unrealistic figure that they're asking for. And we must hope for better things, I think.
I absolutely agree with that. I suspect they're going in very high. I expect it to be knocked back, but that question's been very well raised. I think we need to keep an eye on that one. Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate that. Any more questions on that one? That's a bit eye-watering as it is, so we'll go straight into, if we may, our item on the agenda today, please. So over to you, please, Lynn. Thank you. Land at Jane's Oaks Farm at Mere. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman, members of the members of the committee, members of the public. My name is Linda King. I'm the... Better? Is that better? You can hear me now. Okay. I'll say that again. Good afternoon, Chairman, members of the committee and members of the public. My name is Linda King. I'm the case officer. I've taken over as the case officer for this application, which I'll present to you this afternoon. As you can see from the attached slide, this is a site that is south of Mere. It's about 1 kilometre south of the town of Mere, very close to the Dorset boundary. It is an application for change of use from agricultural land to a site for a gypsy family for 4 plots. So that's 4 mobile homes, 4 touring caravans maximum, and 2 amenity units. Additional landscaping, alteration to the access, and a sewage treatment plant. So this is the site location in more detail. Site with the green arrow. It's a small parcel of land set in a rural environment outside the settlement boundary, in the open countryside. It is not within the AONB. It's about more than 2 kilometres from the AONB boundary to the north, although it is in a special landscape area, which is a saved policy from the Salisbury District Plan. This is the site layout before you, which shows a contained site with 4 mobile homes and 4 touring caravan sites, parking, access, 2 amenity blocks to serve, as they say, for ablutions blocks for the residents, new planting, revised access location to protect a protected tree on the site. It's quite a simple scheme, which we feel will not be detrimental to the landscape in the area. These are the proposed amenity buildings. They're relatively small, as you can see, 7.5 metres by 5 metres, and they are just simple little structures, just over 4 metres high. There is a requirement, which we'll get to later, from your highway officers to actually have hard surface some of the existing openings along the access road to serve as passing places, because this is a relatively narrow road, lightly trafficked road, just to ensure that the highway safety is maintained. Now, this first photograph shows the existing, the black car is parked in the existing, adjacent to the existing access to the site, with the TPO tree you can see, and you can also see a delivery lorry heading for the access to the site. The next photograph shows the condition of the site as it stands at the moment. It's been like this for a while, I understand, and this predates the ownership of the applicant. The applicant is not responsible for any of this. Sort of detritus. It's been there for a long time. It's a overused or overworked and worked out agricultural piece of land. These are old tractors on the site. There is other storage material on the site, but you can also see in the middle of that photograph there are existing hard surfaces and hard standings. This is a sort of more general view of the site taken from the access, looking across the land, which you can see is fairly, well, it's not in agricultural use at the moment. It's rather overgrown and it's a rather sorry state. This is a view looking towards the Woodlands Road junction, which is, Woodlands Road is the nearest road with a link to the village of Mere, which heads to the north. So that gives you a sort of guide to the application site and its criteria and its characteristics. The application before you, as I say, is for the change of use of that land to serve as a residential caravan site for 4 gypsy families. As you're probably well aware, applications of this type have to be considered against both national and local policy. You have a policy in your core strategy, CP47, which sets out a lot of criteria against which an application should be considered. And there is a planning policy for traveller sites, which is rather like the MPPF for traveller sites produced by the government, which also gives a criteria basis for the determination of applications for gypsy and traveller accommodation if a council doesn't have its own development plan documents, rather like a local plan for gypsies and travellers, which identifies sites for the particular groups within the county. At the moment, that's in the process of preparation. It isn't adopted. So without a site-specific allocations, applications therefore have to be determined on the criteria-based policy, which means we determine the applications where they are submitted, and each one has to be considered on its merits against the policies that this council has and also the policies of the national government. You will see from your report that this application has generated a significant amount of local objection for the reasons set out in the report, but you will also note from the statutory consultees, your own statutory consultees, that there are no objections. So there are no objections from your internal consultees on the policy base for this application. And if we go through the planning considerations in the report, I don't need to teach you, core policy 2, the delivery strategy, determines that applications for development outside the settlement boundary should be resisted, but where there are exceptions, and those are recognised in paragraph 4.25 of that document, and one of those exceptions can be specialist accommodation provision for core policy 46 and 47. This is an application that's being considered under core policy 47. So this is effectively an exception policy to your settlement boundary policy. Also see within the report that work is progressing on the Gypsy and Traveller Development Plan document, but it hasn't got far forward yet. But there has been a recent Gypsy and Traveller Accommodation Needs Assessment, which is known as GTAA, and that is a requirement of an evidence gathering base to inform that plan document. And you will see from the evidence submitted within that we are significantly under-provided in terms of 5-year land supply for Gypsy and Traveller sites across the county. And at the last count, I think, was 79 sites required. And that situation has been substantiated in very recent appeal decisions elsewhere in the county, elsewhere than in Mere. And we've made reference to 3 in the committee report, which are all within the last few months, which have concluded that this council doesn't have a 5-year land supply. Those applications were all allowed on appeal when they were considered against the criteria that is in CP 47. So therefore, this application will be considered in a very similar way. And your core policy CP 47 sets out the criteria against which an application for accommodation for gypsies and travellers will be considered. And if I go through them, I've set them all out in the report. If we briefly go through them, criteria 1, that there are no significant barriers to development. The site's not located in an area of flood risk. Your drainage engineers have raised no objection. The Environment Agency have raised no objection. And you will also see there are 2 conditions on the application requiring further details of surface water and foul drainage to be submitted prior to the occupation of the units. And the application also includes a sewage treatment plant, which would be required to be licensed by the Environment Agency. And hopefully that will overcome some concerns about impacts on the local Shreen water, which is a local stream. That the site is served by safe and convenient vehicular access and pedestrian access. As you will know, this application has been in for quite a while, and a lot of the negotiations have been on to make sure that your highway officers are convinced that there is a safe vehicular access. If we go back to the first photograph, where the black car is where the existing access is at the moment. Your tree officer was concerned that that access and to be widened and altered to require to meet your highway officer standards would have an impact on that tree. So therefore, the plan has been amended. We go back to the original layout plan. to re-site that access in a position which your highway officers are happy with and your tree officer is happy with. The applicants have, every time we've asked them for additional information or support, they have provided that information readily to us. And they have also, there is also that requirement for the stopping or the hard surfacing of areas of passing places along the access road that are all within, we've determined they're all within the public highway. So the applicant can do that without further permissions of any third party. The site can be adequately serviced, which is criteria 3. We have no objections from, say, from the Environment Agency in terms of drainage, and other issues will be dealt with under the building regulations to make sure the site can be serviced. It would be no different than a farm worker's dwelling being created in the open countryside in terms of servicing. Criteria 4, that the site is large enough to provide adequate vehicular parking and manoeuvring, as well as amenity space for residents. Again, the site provides adequate parking, turning facilities. You will see there's a condition which limits the size of vehicles which can be kept on the site. There is amenity space for the residents, and the area of land, in this location, oh, sorry, it doesn't work. Further to the west, the applicant owns and controls, so there is, which is intended to be laid down for grazing. So there is amenity space associated with the site. Criteria 5 is that the site is located in or near an existing settlement with a range of facilities. As I mentioned earlier, the site is about 1 kilometre south of Mere, which is listed as a local service centre in the core strategy and does have a good range of facilities. And policy C of planning policy for traveller sites, which is the government publication, acknowledges that gypsy sites can be located within rural or semi-rural settings. And basically, we have had appeal decisions which have determined that anything within about 1 kilometre, sometimes up to a mile from a major service centre, is acceptable as close enough to facilities to meet the criteria set out nationally and locally. The following criteria is that the proposal will not have an unacceptable impact on the character and appearance of the landscape and the amenity of neighbouring properties. The site doesn't have any very close neighbouring residential properties, the closest one being about 240 metres away, mainly on farm buildings. Your landscape officer has looked at this issue very closely in the representation in respect of the impact on the site on the landscape. I'm aware of an appeal decision in Mere a couple of years ago for a large housing development where the inspector held that views from Castle Hill, which is an ancient monument in Mere, would be detrimentally impacted by significant residential development. That was well over 100 units. This is a small site for basically 4 families, or an extended family with 4 caravans. There is a condition you will see proposed in respect of lighting, and it's a similar lighting condition that we would impose on schemes that are in the area of outstanding natural beauty in the Dark Skies Reserve to control and maintain lighting. And we're also looking at landscaping. You can see from this plan that the applicants are proposing additional hedging around the site as the means of enclosure. And there's always that balance between ensuring that the site fits within the landscape and not making it into a stockade, but making sure that there is security for the applicants and the residents on the site. So you will see there are conditions proposed about landscaping and fencing and means of enclosure, all to be agreed prior to the occupation of the site. One of the criteria is that adequate levels of privacy can be provided for the occupiers. This is a rural site with no immediate neighbours, and the site has good hedgerows around it, although they can be reinforced. So I don't think there's any issue about privacy. Another criteria, the site should be appropriate to the scale and character of its surroundings. Now this, as you can have seen from the photographs, which we'll go back to, is a rather sad and dilapidated site that's been left like this for quite a while. This is not the applicant's doing, it's been in existence prior to the applicants acquiring the site. So it does meet your criteria in terms of being a dilapidated site that's in need of refurbishment. There is the opportunity to clear a lot more of the land. The application site for the residential element is, sorry, the application site for the residential element is not the whole of the land you can see in front of you. It's a relatively small parcel of land. The applicant wants to turn the remainder of the land to grazing, so there's an opportunity there to tidy up this site and to replant hedges and actually to improve its landscape setting rather than leaving it in this rather dilapidated condition. Another criteria, the site will not compromise any nationally or internationally recognised designations. As I said before, the site's not in the AONB, and it's also not in a nutrient site. It's not within the drainage catchment of the River Avon. It actually goes to the Stour in Dorset. So therefore, it doesn't have any international designations affecting it. It's effectively an open countryside. You've got no objections from your archaeologists or your ecologists. So therefore, in terms of policy CP47 and the detailed criteria within that policy, we consider that this application meets those criteria and can form an acceptable form of development. If we go on then to other material considerations, and I know this is something you'll be talking about later, but it's 5-year land supply. There is a requirement under the same legislation for market housing for a 5-year land supply as there is for gypsy and traveller sites for a 5-year land supply. And this council, as is shown in the extracts from committee reports and appeal decisions, does not have a 5-year land supply, and we're well off 5-year land supply for gypsies and travellers at the moment. And that is a consideration to be taken into account when determining this application. So therefore, on conclusion, the application is policy compliant in terms of both national policy and local policy, and you have a shortage of 5-year land supply, and the last 3 appeal decisions for similar sorts of scale of development elsewhere in the county, all the appeals have been dismissed, mainly on the grounds of 5-year land supply. The application is therefore recommended to you for approval, subject to the conditions set out in the agenda report.
Thank you, Linda. I appreciate that. This isn't, of course, the only one we've seen in recent times. As we've seen a few of these now. Report's very well written. There's a lot of detail in there. I hope you've read that. But I'm going to invite questions, please, from the committee. And we'll start with James. I see a rash of hands going out. James, Councillor Shepherd, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I look at condition 17, and it mentions 4 technical details of passing waiting bay widening. Where can we see exactly where that is? And is that land owned by the owner of this site? Thank you.
Sorry, through you, Chairman. The land is all public highway. So it's within the ownership of the Highway Authority. And that is one of the things that's taken a little while to get this application to you, for you today, members, because we had to ensure that the applicants could widen or carry out that operation on land that's in the public ownership, and it doesn't require any third-party land.
And has that been agreed?
Yes.
Councillor Gibson, Sarah, thank you.
Sorry, I was just jumping in because that was the Councillor Shepherd has asked part of the question that I was going to ask. The thing that I didn't quite understand about this, and it would be nice to know exactly where it is on the little plan that's on the screen, but in section 17, it talks about the passing waiting bay, but then further down it says available for the passing parking of vehicles at all times thereafter, which didn't seem to me, if it's a passing space, I didn't understand why there would be parking of vehicles, and if it's public highway, then it doesn't seem to me to be appropriate that the applicant would be parking cars or vehicles on the passing bay.
That's the wording that's been suggested by your highway officers.
What, passing and stroke parking?
Yes, all I've done is basically copied their recommendation to me into the report. So I don't think it's intended to be parking. the applicant has got parking within his own site, these are hardened surfaces then that will be available to any users of the highway.
Yes, it's just that my experience of narrow country lanes is that if it's a passing space, the last thing you want is to find that somebody's parked in it to go for a walk, whether it's the applicant or not. So maybe that's something that if we get to a point where we are considering this for approval, we might have a look at this condition and perhaps amend that note about parking of vehicles.
I think I'd be happy to take that wording out.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Good point. Carol, Councillor Gibbs. Thank you.
I wondered, I think it was under, criteria 2, how well used is the highway? Is it, lots of tractors, lots of agricultural vehicles? Is it, it's not used as a cut through for somebody, a shortcut? It didn't look like it to me, but
It is a low use, it is a rural road. It is a road that you can use it from the main sort of road through to Gillingham to get through to the southern part of Mere. But the applicants did, at our requirement, did a traffic count, which your highway officers assessed and were happy with. And we're happy that the level of traffic using the highway at the moment and the level of traffic that we generated by the application were not so sufficient to cause a highway safety issue. And therefore, they have raised no objection on that grounds.
Yeah, Councillor Ridout.
Thank you. Just for clarity, it says the caravan sites and control of development permits 8, which should be no more than 4 static caravans and presumably 4 mobile homes. So what we've got here, am I correct, is 4 mobile homes and 2 amenity buildings, but actually no caravans.
No, you have got 8 caravans because a mobile home is a caravan for the purposes of the
what I
Caravan
was-
Act.
Right. So it's not 4 caravans and 4 mobile homes, it is 8 caravans, which can be either.
Yes,
Right.
but you can only, but the condition is worded in such a way you can only have 4 mobile homes, so 4 meets the criteria of mobile homes and 4 that meet the criteria of touring caravans and 2 amenity blocks.
And can we limit that so that this site doesn't become more than that? Is there a condition that, I was looking at condition
Yes.
16,
Condition
15.
Condition 15 says no more than 8 caravans, as defined in the Caravans Act, of which no more than 4 should be static caravans. So we are limiting it to A, overall number, and then B, type.
And 2 amenity buildings.
Yes. The
That's
amenity buildings are not included in that condition because they're physical development.
Yes.
And then I think I've taken away or proposed somewhere the permitted developments taken away. So you couldn't build another amenity block without planning permission.
And is there any provision for a disabled person on any of these, either static mobile homes or amenity buildings? I mean, as to access to them?
The amenity buildings are single story and can be adapted. They were required from building regs point of view to be adaptable for
Thank you.
disabled access. And there will be nothing to stop the applicant in terms of the mobile homes having a ramped access if required.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. Councillor Newbury.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got a couple of questions. First one, the criterion 2 requires the site to be served by a safe pedestrian access. And clearly we've got quite a number of living units here. I think we can suppose that there will be children, perhaps several children. The village or town of Mere is a mile away. Chances are the children are going to be going to school in Mere. I'm just thinking through, when criterion 2 talks about a safe pedestrian access, that can't be pedestrian access within the site or from the road into the site. It must be a pedestrian access to neighbouring amenities, such as a village school and village shops and so on. And I'm wondering, can the officer show us? I'm not convinced that the highway officer has been on site. Can the case officer show us, do we have some photographs of the country lane that leads from Mere to this site? I take it doesn't have any pavements?
No, they're rural country roads. There is a dichotomy between that requirement for pedestrian access and the guidance in the national policy, which understands that gypsy and traveller sites can often be in rural locations. And that is an area sometimes where there is an understanding that the occupants from the sites are probably going to be car-bound. And that is an area that has been accepted again in appeals up and down the country, that it is unlikely that you will have ease of pedestrian access from sites.
But our development plan is still our development plan, and it requires us to make sure that there is safe pedestrian access. Has the highway officer been asked to advise whether there is safe pedestrian access here?
The highway officer, I know, has been to site, because that's been one of the issues, to make sure that he was satisfied that this development site was safe. Whether he has looked specifically at the pedestrian access side of things, I couldn't 100% say, but he is aware of the policy base that this council works within, because we've discussed it. I think it's very rare, I think, from experience, that you will get a gypsy and traveller site that is also adjacent to a footpath network in terms of pavements. So a lot of sites that are approved, and there's another one that's been approved by this council not very far away from here, which again does not have a pavement access. It's not an unusual situation.
Okay, well, maybe the reason for that is Wiltshire Council's failure to allocate suitable sites that do meet all the criteria. But I mean, that was going to be my next question. But on that point, I mean, can we be told a little bit more about this country lane? I don't think I've ever driven along it. Is it straight? Is there good visibility all the way along it? Or are there twists and turns where some speeding motorist doing 50 could go round a blind corner and hit 2 children? I mean, how safe is it?
Sorry, can you put your microphone?
If you look at the plan in front of you, where the green arrow is and the sort of red and yellow blobs are, the access road is that yellow line immediately to the north of there, which is the access immediately adjacent to the site is a very straight road. The road that then goes north to Mere is more wiggly, but again, it is a country road which has existing residential properties on it. So this is not going to be an unusual situation in terms of accessibility along a rural country lane for a small additional residential use.
Okay, well, we'll hear from the local member, no doubt, in due course about the safety. My other question was going to be about the Hill-Martin decision, and the Hill-Martin inspector calls himself an inspector for some reason. He is focusing quite rightly on Court Policy 47, and he seems to be saying that even though we don't have this provision for gypsy and traveller sites that we've intended to make, that we do still need to have compliance with Court Policy 47, and he finds that the flooding, the only exception to the compliance is the flooding one, and he felt able to condition that in such a way that it wasn't a problem. So it seemed to me that he was saying we did still have to make sure, and I think you are saying. But the question of the supply, we see on page 37, a gypsy and traveller development plan document to be undertaken alongside the local plan review was programmed in the 2017 local development scheme for adoption in 2021. However, the 2022 version puts back the adoption of the gypsies and traveller DPT to at best the end of 2024. And I'm just wondering, do we have anyone in the room who can tell us? I mean, that's a slippage of 7 years, and it seems as if we're in difficulties about giving these permissions because there's been a slippage of 7 years. Can anybody explain that to us?
Sorry, thank you, Chair, if I may come in. So yes, as you're aware, that our team is working hard on the local plan review at the moment, and we published an updated local development scheme, as you refer to in a moment, which deals with the timetable for that review and also for the Gypsy Traveller excuse me, development plan document, which is also progressing in parallel with the local plan review. You're absolutely right that the intention originally was to produce a plan that was going to be adopted much sooner. But because of the need to align the work on that development plan document with the work on the local plan review, the timetables has moved and the times has slipped. That's absolutely correct. But the intention is that we do progress in line with the timetable that's been published. The work is going on behind the scenes to look at the sites for allocation and the way the document will be pulled together and the evidence that underpins that. That work is ongoing, and the intention is that by the end of 2024 that we will be working towards having in place a new local plan and a new Gypsy and Traveller plan, which will replace the policy within the existing core strategy that deals with this at the moment.
Could I have a quick follow-up to that, Chairman? I mean, clearly, we hear what you say about bringing the review into line with the local development plan, but clearly there was an urgent need here for this review to take place. Why would we want to bring the delivery of it into line with a process that's much, much slower, so that there's such a long delay in arriving at such a document?
The intention isn't necessarily that we want the documents to align in terms of timescales, but actually conveniently they do in terms of the work and the evidence that underpins both of those documents. Clearly there are some overlapping issues in terms of identifying sites, looking at things, some of the technical matters such as transportation work and some of the constraints around the status of land, etc., which actually works in parallel, and it makes sense that you do that actually at the same time. So although in theory you could adopt a Gypsy and Traveller plan at a different time scale, because of the work that's taking place on the local plan review, it actually makes sense to align the evidence work and the work that we're doing on both plans. So that's why it's sort of border coincidence, I guess, but in terms of also the work that's taking place, it makes sense that some of those work streams do take place at the same time. And although one might seem a much more straightforward plan because it's a single issue and obviously not as complex as a local plan review, the reality is that both documents actually are quite complex, and it's not easy to sort of identify sites that in the right locations to meet those needs that also address the technical constraints that we're dealing with.
Well, I'm sure you're absolutely right. It's not easy, but the idea that it makes sense completely baffles me, but I'll leave it there, Chairman.
Thank you, Christopher. Yes, I just want to pick up that point. There has to be a synergy, I think, between the two elements of the local plan, and this has been going on for years. This is pre-unitary. Back in the North West District Council days when I led on the GTAA, we were woefully short then, and nobody appears to have been able to grasp the nettle in terms of provision. And I think when we became a unitary authority, we had 120. Today it's 79 to meet the 5-year supply issue, as I understand it. And it's been a very difficult issue to get hold of, not least because the dynamics surrounding the provision of Gypsy and Traveller sites are very fraught. And we have been set, I know certainly years ago, we were set a certain set of criteria and metrics which actually weren't the ones that the Gypsy and Traveller community wanted either. So that there was an immediate disconnect between what we were prepared to provide and what they wanted. And I suspect we're still up against that today, which is why we're having to take these sites on a as they come basis until we've finally got our set out our stall and got our act together and actually got the sites sorted. So it's not an easy situation. It certainly isn't an easy one for the planning officers, and certainly not for those that are trying to craft some kind of synergy or symbiotic relationship between other elements of the local plan. So I do understand where Nick's coming from with that, as I do Christopher too. It's a difficult situation to be found in. Carol, Councillor King, you put your hand up.
Thank you. It's more of a point of order, I think. It's just when you summarize the consultation responses and Mere is mentioned as having a significant number of the 9 points of criteria. They're not listed. So it's a bit hard, you know, I know they didn't have access to the officer's report at the time, but it's a bit hard to see whether they had any other points of view that we might consider more relevant. You know, all we have really is the officer's report with kind of the rebuttals, but we don't have listed what they, you know, what they said. And other reports seem to have more detail about what the council has said. You know, just in order of fairness, really, I thought.
So you're saying we have the rebuttals, but we don't have the items that support it?
The Mere Town Council comment is reported in full. I haven't rejected it or anyway. That's the full comment of Mere Town Council on this application.
I suspect we
Sorry,
may,
likewise for Gillingham.
Yeah.
Because I always feel that because that's representing the local community, I always put those in full.
I suspect we may hear more in due course. James, Councillor Shepherd, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'd like to mention the word sustainability, because I know a lot of farmers who apply for change of use to cottages and such like are often refused due to sustainability, their lack of proximity to bus stops, etc. So one question would be, where is the nearest bus stop, perhaps, to this site? The other thing is there any provision for electric charging on site, or is that, again, something that doesn't really come into play? Thank you.
I can answer the first one last. Way around. Electric charging points are now dealt with under building regulations. So if there's a requirement for electric charging points on a site, they're dealt with under the building reg side of the application, which will still be required because they've got the amenity block buildings proposed and drainage works, etc. So I don't see why, if they're required, they won't be added on to the application site. And the nearest bus stop, I think from memory, is on the main north-south road from Gillingham up to Mere. There are bus stops along that route, and they are about hourly, I think the buses are.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Foster, Adrian.
First of all, I'd like to thank Christopher for asking the two questions I had in mind. That's okay. It was more eloquently put by you doing it. But I think it would be wise for this committee, if they're reminded to register their concern about us not having the 5-year development plan for the GTAA. Purely and simply because, and we've experienced a few of these now, and there's obviously some that have come before my day. We're not in control of where the Gypsy and Traveller sites are going to be. And it's just like not having a 5-year land supply. We're having to allow them to be wherever anybody applies for them to be, which means we're not in control at all. And therefore, all the aspects that have come under discussion now are peripheral to the decision-making policy. And surely it must be better for Wiltshire Council and its residents to have a plan so that we can then have a say when they're outside of the areas that we've designated them to be. And I think that will probably be better for the whole of society, including the Gypsies, if they have designated sites and everything, rather than speculative development. But the small question I had on this one development was, it was mentioned about the waste, and from the comments, would it be correct to say that this is not going to be on the main sewers and it will be an independent sewage system on site?
Yes, part of the application is for a private packaged treatment plant.
Councillor York, Rob, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Point of clarification, really. The officer's report refers to a single family, but in the covering letter that came with the application, it refers to 4 families. Now, to my mind, as soon as you say 4 families, you're looking at a minimum of possibly 8 vehicles, whereas a single family, you could say possibly 2. Now, that's going to be a big increase in traffic. Now, I'm just wondering if the highways officer's comments referred to 4 families or 1 family.
The application is for 4 residential units, effectively. The static mobile homes are for individual elements of the, it's an extended family unit. So you've got the applicant, his older children who are seeking to marry, and parents living as an extended family unit on the same site.
So should we really be looking at 4 families rather than 1 extended family?
That's what we're looking at is an application for 4 caravans, 4 plots, they're known as pitches in terms of Gypsy and Traveller policy, and a pitch is a mobile home, a static mobile home, and a touring caravan, and an amenity block, and that is what you're looking at. We're not conditioning this to an individual family. It's not recommended that you make an application like this personal to the applicant. So what we're looking at is an application for 4 mobile homes and 4 touring units and 2 pollution blocks, effectively, for gypsies and travellers. So it's wider than who is occupying it. It's the use of land is what you're looking at.
Okay, thank you.
Andrew, you put your hand up.
Could I just add to that as well? And the specific question around what the highways officer had regard to. The highways officer would have had regards to the fact that the proposal was for 4 pitches with 4 families. And going back to the earlier question, the highways officer would also have had regards to the circumstances of the lane, their ability to, its ability to accommodate pedestrians and the safety aspects of that. So that would have all been taken on board in the highways officer's consideration and his eventual no objection.
Thank you, Andrew. Right, Ernie.
Thanks, Chairman. Just clarification, really. The case officer mentioned in her presentation about the dilapidated state of the site, which I accept is nothing to do with the applicant. But I recall the last time we had some training, we were told that the situation or the appearance of an application site was totally irrelevant, because otherwise people purposely let them go to rack and ruin before they put in a planning application. Is that no longer the case? Since it's been, you know, it was mentioned 2, possibly 3 times by the case officer.
You're right in that we don't normally take account of the state of the land because, as you say, it can be used as a way to say, well, it's such a mess, you must let me have something on there. The fact that you've left it to get a mess is neither here nor there. Within your document and within the government document, it basically says we should be trying to focus Gypsy and Traveller sites to areas of brownfield or previously developed land, so it's not using greenfield sites, because the policy nationally accepts that a lot of Gypsy and Traveller sites are in the open countryside. So if you've got land that's in the open countryside that's already slightly degenerated a little, and there's an opportunity to tidy it up by granting the permission, then those are sites that you should look to first before you look at an open field. So it's a site, it's very specific to this type of application rather than a generalised application. If that makes any sense.
Councillor Newbury, Christopher.
Following on from that, I read in the report that the site has no planning history. So is the case officer telling us that this is a brownfield site or a previously developed site?
No, because the previous use of land was agricultural, and agriculture isn't classed as brownfield. And a dilapidated agricultural site is not classed as previously developed land. It's still agricultural land.
Okay, because, I mean, Councillor Clark asked a question about whether, well, we heard his question, and the officer's reply was that is normally the case, but, and then I can't remember the exact form of the sentence, but the but was followed by brownfield land and previously developed land. And is the case officer now saying that this is not, in fact, brownfield land or previously developed land?
No, there's a sort of list. I can't remember the exact wording, but I'm sure I can find it if you want it, that talks about sites that are dilapidated, previously developed land and brownfield sites, because the policy, the national policy, covers all land in the country, and it can cover brownfield land, say on the very edge of a settlement in a larger urban area. Quite a lot of Gypsy and Traveller sites have been on brownfield land. This one isn't. It's a rural agricultural piece of land, but it is degraded. It is not a greenfield site, and it is the type of site that the national policy suggests that you would be considering for an allocation.
Okay, could somebody read out to us the bit of policy which overrides our general rule?
Yes, it's actually your policy 47, which is on page 19. Proposals for new Gypsy and Traveller sites or travelling show people plots and yards will only be granted where there is no conflict with other planning policies and where there's no barrier to development exists. New development should be situated in sustainable locations with preference generally given to previously developed land or vacant or derelict site in the need of renewal.
Oh, okay, so you're saying this is not previously developed, but it is derelict.
Yes.
So it's only in the context of this core policy 47 that the general rule that Councillor Clark was asking you about doesn't apply, is that it?
Yes, it steers a specific form of type of development to specific sites.
Okay, and do we know what derelict means?
No, not specifically, but I would give the impression this site, from the photographs that I've shown you, is and has been for many years in a bit of a mess. It is not a greenfield site. It's not the field next door. It's a site that's already got hard standings on it. It's already had buildings on it. So in terms of, and the fencing that's around there at the moment is hideous. Removing that will actually be an improvement to the area, and putting normal fencing and hedging back could be argued to be an improvement in the landscape to what is there at the moment.
Okay, Chairman. Well, I'm very impressed that the case officer was able to put a finger on that so quickly. But I think maybe when we're reviewing the local plan, we might want to look again about whether we leave in the bit about derelict land, because I think Ernie Clark's point is a good one, that we don't really want to be encouraging people to get their land into a terrible state as a sort of a foot in the door towards development that they wouldn't otherwise get. So perhaps the strategic planning will just sort of make a little mental note that perhaps we want to look again at the word derelict.
Yes, that's a fair point. It's not the first time that's been raised either, so that is a fair point. There is a tension, of course, here between the fact that we've got a shortfall of 79 sites on the one hand, and potentially core policy 47 on the other. And of course, I'm urging you to make your decision as you see it, vis-a-vis core policy 47. I just want to pick up on something that was raised earlier, and that was that we seem to be bounced very often into just approving these because we have no choice. That isn't true. We do have core policy 47, and it's us to determine whether an application squares with that or not. But I just want to reflect on the situation we have had in the past. I know the ODPM, the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister, years ago, set out guidelines and said that these sites should be within 3 miles of a school and 5 miles of a doctor, and there were all sorts of criteria that were laid down. And when we engaged, and I'm talking a number of years ago now, with the Gypsy and Traveller community, they said, well, that might be what you've been told we want, but that isn't actually what we want. And so the GTAA, the whole process collapsed at the time, and that's arguably where we still are today, where we're still trying to find common ground, where we can provide with a DPD for these sites that actually corresponds with what the Gypsy and Traveller community want in the first place. So it's never going to be an easy situation. And in that sense, we do have to take these applications on an ad hoc basis. as they come to us, which is, of course, where we're at today. But we have refused sites. So I want to steer clear of the notion that we get bounced into approving these. The trick is, and the challenge is for us today, to determine how closely we believe this follows Core Policy 47, and with a mind and a recognition of the 79 site shortfall as well. So on that note, if we don't have any more questions, technical questions, I'm going to ask then for our first speaker, which is Sean Lyons, please. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, before I make my submission, it may be helpful to you and colleagues to know that I, Dr. Price and Mr. Skinner have coordinated our submissions to try and avoid tedious repetition for you. They should, however, be regarded as a running whole.
That would be very welcome. Thank you. We'll watch that with interest. Thank you.
Very well. I'll make my submission if I may. Mr. Chairman, the proposed use of this site is inappropriate. It is common ground that the site, being an open countryside, contravenes basic policies and that the 9 criteria have to be met. The recommendation to approve should not be relied upon because of flaws in its preparation. Some judgments made and conclusions drawn in the process are based on inaccurate data or insufficient data. The failure of Wiltshire to have a plan for a 5-year supply of such sites and the consequent ongoing reliance on individual applications has conditioned officials, either consciously or unconsciously, to discharge their duties in a manner designed to make it possible to recommend approval. Mr. Chairman, the application should be refused. If this is not agreed, then at the very least, the decision should be deferred and further and better reports should be sought. Such a deferment would also enable the committee to arrange a site visit to this fragile and under pressure corner of rural Wiltshire. I turn to deal with landscaping. My colleagues will deal with amenity and scale, access to facilities, and sustainability. Landscape. This site is known to the county. It has twice, in 2005 and 2008, been the subject of prosecution over the state of the land. In 2011, a fine of £6,500 was levied. Today, the report concentrates on the site as it is, rather than on the impact of the proposal. This is an example of the distorted thinking brought about by the primacy of need over the regulations. Only half the land is to be developed. It appears the unused half will be used for grazing. Grazing for what, one wonders? Unicorns? However, the unused half of the land will certainly act as a land bank for future application to extend the dwelling site. It is worrying for planning generally when neglect of a site can be used to bolster the applicant's case for a change of user. The report opines that the current state of the land detracts from the area and cites boundaries, fencing, gates, and old vehicles and dilapidated structures, all matters which should be dealt with by enforcement procedures. It is then suggested that the area would be improved by the approval of the application and that the restoration of some of the landscape character would thereby be achieved. This means it's the opinion of officials that the landscape will be restored or improved by the introduction of 10 man-made structures and associated hard standings into a rural and agricultural area aptly described as comprising small fields, narrow lanes, isolated farmsteads and cottages surrounded by fields. This is a perverse conclusion. These conditions, except there is an impact on the countryside. It is barely stated in the report. Mr. Chairman, agricultural hedges and deciduous trees take 20 years to grow and require continuing care and attention. Conditions stipulating the need for landscaping and screening are pious hopes. Their long-term enforcement is impossible, and they will not protect the countryside or negate the impact. There is no comment on the exposed nature of the site, Being on the slope of a shallow valley, it is entirely visible from points both on the same side and on the corresponding rise on the other side. That the impact is acceptable is perforce a personal and subjective judgment that has been made, but one which is genuinely hard to understand. It is one on which committee members should not rely. It is contended that in this rural area, the impact on landscape would in fact be unacceptable and permanent. Deciduous trees will not protect the countryside. This committee can. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Sean. Appreciate that. To Bill Price, then, please. Thank you.
Thank you. I will speak about scale and amenity. The report states that the site currently detracts from the pleasant rural character of the area, but then considers that the construction of this dwelling complex will not affect this character, and indeed opines that it would restore some of the landscape character. It also states that it is considered appropriate to its surroundings. This is without logic. The report does not deal with the reality of approaching this settlement of dwellings. On the council's own figures for family size, 4 gypsy families, if indeed only 4 families occupy these 8 dwellings, will result in a population of between 24 and 32. Some 15 or 16 motor vehicles may be expected. According to the latest census figures publicly available, the postcode in which the site is placed has a population of 9. This site will therefore increase the body count in its immediate area by 260 to 350%. This development would constitute the biggest conurbation in the immediate area other than Mere itself, but it is still considered to be in scale with its surroundings, which are characterized as consisting of isolated farms and dwellings. This is a further subjective judgment, which is unsupported by any body of evidence or argument and is wholly disputed. The 10 structures will be of modern design and construction and will bear little or no resemblance to the existing structures in the area. These existing buildings are of traditional stone and brick and of some age and distinction, grade 2 listed. This development will be completely out of character and scale and will remain so as it ages. The judgment formed on scale and character is unjustified and is influenced by the need to gain approval. The increase in population and vehicles transposes into light pollution and noise pollution and traffic density and into the general interference with nature and amenity that human activity of any sort brings with it. The report deals with amenity in one sentence and treats it as a matter of distance, saying the site does not have any near residential neighbours and the nearest dwellings are 240 metres away. This scanty and inadequate dispatch of this important factor is insufficient. The impact of this relatively huge increase in population has been ignored both as to scale and to amenity. Conditions seek to ameliorate the light pollution are stipulated, but monitoring of the long-term compliance will not occur, and this scale of development will fundamentally change the character of this area and will adversely affect the lives and amenity of all those currently dwelling therein. The report fails to give proper consideration to these factors. Mr. Chairman, your committee cannot fairly rely upon the recommendations in this report. The application should be refused or a decision deferred. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Quinton Skinner, please. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, access to facilities. The report says that the site is 1 kilometre south of Mere, and that in some cases distances of up to 1 mile have been accepted as not being away. The nearest point of Mere is indeed 1 kilometre as the crow flies. However, this criterion is about access to facilities, and in Mere, the doctor, pharmacy, co-op and post office are all in the square or adjacent to it. The shortest route to the square is 2.4 kilometres, 1.5 miles. The first 0.6 miles is a single track road with no pavements or lighting. The report is misleading. The figure of 1 kilometre gives a false impression of the proximity of the vital facilities that this criterion addresses.
This false impression enables a recommendation for approval to be made. Sustainability. This misleading figure of 1 kilometre has a further implication. The core policies all refer to sustainable development, and this has a quantifiable meaning where distance and travel are concerned. An extremely relevant example of this is available in this exact area. A third of a mile from Jane Oaks Farm, there is an existing gypsy site, the stables. Approved in 2015 under the different policies then existing, it allowed for 1 pitch for stables and grazing. No stables have been built and most of the associated conditions have not been met. The Wiltshire Council Planning Department is currently processing an application to add a further 10 pitches. The most direct route to the square in Mere from the stables site is some 1.4 miles, less than the site in question. The highway report on the stables application concludes with a recommendation that the application be refused as the site is located outside the existing village policy boundary and is considered to be contrary to the sustainability policies contained in the Wiltshire Core Strategy and the National Planning Policy Framework, which aims to reduce the need to travel, particularly by private car, and encourage the use of sustainable transport alternatives. This means that in the applications for 2 sites which would use the same centre for facilities and the same public transport, one is recommended for refusal on grounds which the other report doesn't even canvass, possibly because of the misleading distance quoted of 1 kilometre. The site with the shorter distance to travel is assessed as not sustainable. A full highway report on the Jane Oaks site should have revealed exactly the same problem and should have led to a recommendation to refuse. The lack of any such report is a serious omission and casts doubts on the reliability of the recommendation. And so the application should be refused. If it is felt appropriate to call for further particulars, it's vital that the 2 applications should be treated in the same way, and also that this committee should be fully aware of the interaction of the 2 applications and of the catastrophic consequences for the character and amenity of the small, beleaguered area of rural Wiltshire were they to be approved. Please visit the sites. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Clinton. Appreciate that. You've all done very well time-wise. Thank you for that too. So Philip Brandon, please, the agent. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, with regard to the principle of development, you have policy 47. That expresses preferences for the use of previously developed vacant or derelict land. In this particular case, we have vacant and derelict land, which fits in with that preference. And policy 47 is deriving from national policy because the same description is contained within planning policy for traveller sites. Planning policy for traveller sites asks for weight to be given in favour of the use of vacant and derelict sites and degraded sites. So that preference is in national policy as well as your local policy. What policy 47 does not do is restrict the provision of sites within the countryside outside of existing settlements. In fact, it specifically mentions sites being outside of settlements, as does planning policy for traveller sites. That makes clear that gypsy sites can be appropriately located within rural and semi-rural areas. And I would imagine that all, and certainly the vast majority of the cases that have gone to appeal in Wiltshire have taken place on sites in the countryside outside of settlements. As far as access to services is concerned, there's confusion amongst the people that have spoken previously about the phrase away from settlements and proximity or reasonable access to services. The away from settlements comes out of planning policy for traveller sites. It's nothing to do with proximity to services. It's proximity to settlements. And away from has, as the planning officer has noted, that's been generally recognised by inspectors on appeal as being distances of up to a mile. But as far as reasonable access to services is concerned, that's a different judgment. There's no requirement in Policy 47 that access should be by means of transport other than the private car. There's no definition of what reasonable access is in terms of proximity. On appeal, inspectors have accepted that distances of 3 to 5 miles have got reasonable access to community services and facilities. So we're well within the range that's been accepted by inspectors on appeal. In this case, if it's 1.5 miles to the services available in Mere, then I would suggest that that does constitute reasonable access. As far as highway safety is concerned, gypsy and traveller sites typically generate less traffic than conventional housing because of the potential for shared trips. In my experience, traffic generation from gypsy sites tends to be about half that would be expected from conventional housing, because mothers will take daughters off to the shops, or they'll band together to take children to school. So that just relating the number of households to the amount of traffic is not as simple with gypsy sites as it is with conventional housing. With conventional housing, yes, you would expect 8 vehicles for 4 pitches, and you would expect that to generate possibly 8 vehicle movements per day for each household. It's probably half that for gypsy sites. And there is, in this case, no objection from the local highway authority, who are the authority responsible for maintaining highway safety along these rural lanes. As far as character and appearance is concerned, the planning officer and landscape officer both note the poor state of the land. As I've said, that is a relevant consideration, which is taken into account in both local and national policy. Subject to appropriate landscaping, your officers agree that the proposed development would improve the visual appearance and character of the land. But planning policy for traveller sites doesn't expect gypsy and traveller sites to be hidden from view.
Philip. Yeah, that's fine.
Well, I won't go on about
Finish what you're saying, if you will. But,
the last bit that I wanted to cover was about the context for this decision, because this authority has got in comparative terms, a huge need for gypsy and traveller sites. It's got no means of providing those through the development plan other than through the use of Policy 47. So the way that you interpret the criteria in Policy 47 needs to reflect the number of pitches that you need to bring forward in the next 5 years.
okay, point taken. I want to draw you to a close there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate that. Leslie Travers, please.
Mayor Town Council, thank you very much, Chairman. First of all, I must say how heartened I am by the endorsement of over 50 objections to this planning application, and grateful thanks to the eloquence of the 3 gentlemen to my left. Mayor Town Council resolved to recommend refusal on grounds that not only would it constitute development in the open countryside, an agricultural land that has not previously been developed, nor is it a derelict site in need of renewal, but that the site fails to meet a significant number of the 9 points of criteria that are laid out in the Core Policy 47 of the adopted Wiltshire Core Strategy document. Due to the unfortunate experience noted by nearby residents following the granting of planning permission for a nearby gypsy site, members of the Town Council also felt it necessary to resolve that should the Planning Authority grant planning consent for this application, that it should be conditioned to encompass the criteria in point 3 of the Core Policy 47. In other words, that the site should be supplied with essential services such as water, power, sewerage, drainage and waste disposal prior to any residential occupation, and also that the hard-standing surfaces and access points should be installed prior to any residential occupation being allowed. We are very mindful of the impending planning application for 10 further caravans on the nearby gypsy site, taking into account that only 2 were originally given planning permission. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you for your submission. So I'm going to hand over now, please, if I may, to Councillor George Jeans. Thank you, George.
Thank you. I'll try and address a few points that I've heard raised from councillors and speakers. The distance to the centre of Mere and the means of getting there. There is a footpath shown which comes off of this lane, but it's further along the lane and it crosses a sewage works, which several times a year is flooded. So I couldn't recommend it for continuous use for gaining access to the centre of the town, because I think it was Councillor Newbury that raised the question regarding pedestrian. Regarding buses, Mere has got a shortage. We have got, and I don't wish to mislead members, but I believe it's experimental bus put on at the moment. It benefits from the £2 per trip at the moment, which is in force, but I believe it's an experimental service. We've been encouraged to use it as councillors, local councillors, etc. And that I've been on it, and there was another passenger with me on one occasion, and on the other occasion, nobody at all. So I personally can't see what it'll last. I heard it stated, I think it was by the planning officer, that ran every hour. That is actually correct, around the centre of the day for a couple of trips, but usually it's more like 2 hours. And that, as I've made the point, we've got very poor transport links, so where it reflects on the application or not, as it was raised, I've explained the situation the best I can. The derelict, if the site is derelict, I'm not going to argue where it is or not. I've heard the exchanges between officers and councillors, but I would like to make the point to the committee, which they obviously realise, if it is derelict, that's not an overriding reason for it to be granted planning permission. And now I'll move on to what my statement is. About 20 years ago, an attendee at Mere Parish Council, it is now a town council, presented to us an idea of building an exceptional house for the open market that derived from the then recently introduced government exception policy, being a planning application on the adjacent site. In other words, it was in the field next door on the corner. The planning reference, so as to give it validity, is S/1999/0751. This application was refused. The present application is based around an exception policy to the local plan core strategy, and officers find this acceptable. The fact, as brought out in the officer's report, Wiltshire is short of a 5-year land supply for market housing or for gypsy and traveller sites, so we're short on both. This does not on its own guarantee permission will be granted. Nearby, in the last few years, an application was refused for 134 dwellings by an inspector because of its impact on the ancient monument of Castle Hill at Mere. The inspector made no reference, as the applicant of that application did, to Wiltshre's shortage of land supply as a reason to accept that application. So bear in mind it was refused purely on the impact to the ancient monument of Castle Hill. The land at Jane Oaks Farm is further from Castle Hill, but still is in clear sight of Castle Hill. If this application is allowed, even though artificial light may be conditioned to that in effect allowed for the dark skies of the nearby AONB, it will still be seen with all the domestic paraphernalia of the application. A precedent in planning law cannot be made, as I understand. However, this application will encourage other applications that will further impact on the ancient monument of Castle Hill. The area of the application is flattish, being on the edge of the Blackmore Vale, and the views from the ancient monument of Castle Hill are spectacular. Wiltshire has an exception policy, Core Policy 47 of the Wiltshire Core Strategy Local Plan, which must be satisfied for a proposal of a Gypsy and Traveller site to be awarded. I suggest Mere and Gillingham Town Council should be supported in that this application should be refused. It does not fully comply with Wiltshire Core Policy 47. The setting impacts on the ancient monument of Castle Hill. The application then would probably be decided at an appeal. Mere Town Council requested that I call this application in, and I would point that just because they're against applications, they do not always ask for me to call them in. So the point is they feel quite strongly about this one. Wiltshire has no DPD, that's Development Plan Document, include a 5-year land supply for market housing or Gypsy and Traveller sites. It finds hard to refuse sites that would, if it had, specified sites. Wiltshire must address this lack of DPD. However, I asked the committee to note, as said above, at a recent appeal for market housing nearby in Mere, the inspector obviously found the ancient monument of Castle Hill carried most weight, more weight than Wiltshire's lack of a 5-year land supply, which I understand the officers pointed out to us. Most of the Gypsy and Traveller sites that have been refused is to do with a lack of land, and therefore, in this case, I'm arguing that the weight should be given to the ancient monument of Castle Hill. Should you permit this application and allow further impact on the ancient monument of Castle Hill, I would ask some conditions that are left to officers are further clarified at this meeting and minuted. For instance, a sign by condition at the entrance to the proposed site stating only vehicles up to 3.5 tonnes can enter the site as agreed by planning condition, because that is in the report, or the legally correct wording. Height of the main gate specified to the committee at this meeting at the height suggested by the landscape officer. Any planting and fencing, the strategic planning committee should be aware of what the officers would be likely to accept. That is how high or lack of materials, etc. Another condition would be, I'll ask through the chair to the officer, is it regarding generators. I know it may be environmental, but I feel surely that somehow a condition or even an informative could be put on. There is a caravan site not far away, which I'm adding to my notes here, which wind in the wrong direction with a generator running that wasn't a quiet one could be very annoying. Would officers please reply to me through the chairman regarding these possible conditions I have suggested or questioned? The other ones are that I heard mentioned about parking in the passing place, a councillor has raised. Another point, it may already be in the report, and I've missed it. Can any permitted development rights be removed? I'd like to also amplify what one of the existing councillors has already put forward, is that regarding electrification, vehicles are going that way. I know it's building regs. It was June of last year, I know that from my own information, that it was brought in, and I believe it would apply to this site. But even if it's only an informative, for the sake of clarity, that for any enforcement officer, etc., attending the site, that it should be made clear that there should be an electric charging facility on site. The other thing is, I heard services mentioned. There may be water on site, I don't know. But again, it should really be put in place before residential occupation takes place. I would also ask the committee, suggest to officers any further information to proposed condition they wish, which they've been doing so far, which may or may not include that above. Many of the proposed conditions state the applicant has not given sufficient information regarding the proposed conditions. This concludes my statement.
Thank you, George. I appreciate that once again. I'm going to invite you, Linda, to come back. I know you've been writing feverishly. I suspect you've got a few things you want to come back on. Do you?
Yes, Chairman, through you.
Yes, please do.
To remind myself what they are now. Yes, I've looked back at the highway comments in respect of the other application we've got on the go at the moment. Just bear with me, I'll just find them. Which basically, I accept that Mr. Skinner has said that the Highway Authority object to the proposal for the 10 site as being contrary to policy in terms of being outside of settlement boundary. But then they also go to say, noting that other legislation exists to support the provision of gypsy and traveller sites, I should be guided by you on the principle of these proposals. So the Highway Authority are giving us their view on their policies. We have to look at the policies, as members know, in the totality of a local plan. And we've also got site-specific objections to that site, which are yet to be resolved. So that application, no doubt, will come back to members at another date. The landscaping comments raised by Councillor Jeans in respect of the appeal decision for Castle Hill. Yes, that was for 134 dwellings, a much more significant development, much closer to Castle Hill than this proposal that's before you today, which I think you'd be hard pushed to see it from Castle Hill in amongst the other small-scale settlement, small-scale development in terms of farms and other buildings as a caravan site just further down the road. So I don't think the impact is the same. Your landscape officer gave me a very detailed comment on his views on the application site, looking at your policy 51, which is landscape, which also looks to protect the OMB against 47. And he's concluded that with suitable landscaping, that he actually supported the application. It's quite unusual for an officer to support an application rather than comment. So from a landscaping point of view, a lot of consideration was given by your landscape, qualified landscape officers who've looked at it and felt that the scheme is not contrary to the policies within the core strategy. The comments from Councillor Jeans on proposed conditions, wanting a sign at the entrance to say that limiting the size of vehicles. I think that will be excessive. The applicant would have a condition to that effect. It's not something that we would normally impose on other forms of development, and we have to be careful that we are treating the applicants the same as anyone else. So I don't think that's a reasonable condition. Your landscape officer did suggest that all fences and gates on the site conditioned to be a maximum of 1.2 metres high and an open agricultural style. We've got to look at that in conjunction with the security of the applicants, because I know from dealing with other similar sites in other parts of the country, that unfortunately, Gypsy and traveller families can be targeted by the outside world. So there's a degree of security we need to ensure on an application, and whether open style fences of 1.2 metres high will be adequate to protect the occupants, I'm not sure. So that's why there's a condition to say that those details need to be submitted to us and approved prior to the occupation of the site, because that's something we probably will need to discuss and look at. Generators on site and the need for services, I can accept that we do want the site to be serviced, and I think that's the applicant's intention. I don't think we can put a condition on saying there should be no generators. I don't think that's reasonable. We've talked about electric charging points, and I think an informative note to that effect will be a sensible thing, because it is covered by other legislation, and that's something we could add. We've already talked about taking the word parking out of the passing places condition, and I think that will be reasonable. So that was my comment on the suggestions by Councillor Jeans.
Thank you for that, Neil. In which case, I want to move to debate now. I'm going to invite a member of the committee, if you want to come forward with a proposal, and then we can open this up to debate. Nobody? Oh, Councillor Trotman.
Thank you, Chairman. Been looking carefully at this, and there's a huge amount of technical questions put, first of all, which took over an hour, and we obviously looked at all of those, or we had to process those in our mind, and obviously with the relevant local people that have spoken against the actual application. One of the items on the appeal decisions, especially the one at Bushton Hill Martin that I dealt with some years ago and had been refused by the committee, of course, was a retrospective application. And that particular gentleman had ripped out hedges, trees and everything and set up the caravans before even a planning application come forward, which obviously sets the committee in a slightly different area of decision making, which I have to be careful with this one, because what I see here with a very sort of a smaller site, squared, with accessibility within the countryside, away from the settlement, but close enough for sustainability issues, on a site that is obviously derelict, but we have to we're mindful of that. I really felt that this site would be adequate for the family and the extended family put here. And so I will propose that we grant permission subject to the following conditions 1 to 20 and the informatives 1 to 3 from pages 25 to 30, but reducing, deleting the word parking. And also I would like to add, if I get a seconder for this, that we have to, if generators are in use, that they're put in buildings to mitigate any noise reflection to any further settlement. So I seek a seconder for this before we go into debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Newby, you put your hand up. Was that?
I didn't put it up to second anything, Chairman.
Okay.
I was wanting to speak, but I will speak to the motion. If it isn't
all right, I'll
seconded,
come
I'll
back to you in
propose
just a
something
minute.
different.
Councillor Shepherd, James, happy to second that. Yep. Sorry, James, can you just put your, sorry.
Forgive you for doing that. Can I also ask if we could also add the informative of charging points as well as part of the recommendations?
Of what, sorry?
The charging points.
Yeah, to put a charging point on site. Whether they can be charged, electric vehicles could probably be charged from generators, to be quite honest with you. So whether or not you're going to get a line of electricity to do that, I'm not sure. But as an informative, it would be sensible at this stage to do that.
I'm happy to second.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Linda, just going back, I'll come to you in just a minute, Sarah. So you picked that up, the informative of a charging point. Councillor Gibson.
I was.
Oh, sorry. Can I just pick up a point on Councillor Shepherd's comment? Is that if we are going to include an informative on charging points, the reason for having electric charging points on the whole is to reduce one's carbon footprint if they're charging those vehicles with a generator. Slightly counterproductive. So can I suggest that something that came up earlier with the concern for generators is that in the same way that we have a condition which talks very fully and really very clearly and very well put concerning foul and surface water drainage before commencement, is there any reason why a condition to have a connection for mains electricity is not conditioned on the site beforehand, or is that something that is not generally used on these sites? Because that would therefore make the suggestion of Councillor Shepherd viable.
It's not generally used because we don't do it on normal housing, because sometimes people go off-grid. You know, there are other ways of providing electricity. It's not a normal condition that I would expect to see. But again, we can put it as an informative note so that it gives the intent of the council. And I don't see why we can't do that.
Councillor Newbury, Christopher.
Thank you, Chairman. I was just looking at the criteria. I thought there was something in the criteria about services being available, but just trying to find it. Well, what I was going to say, Chairman, if I had got in to speak, I'm not going. I'm speaking against the motion for permission. If I'd got in first, I would have moved a motion for a site visit, because I thought that the points were well made, that there were some flaws in the officer report, in particular in the landscape officer's comments. And I thought that before we went against the local objections, the Mere and Gillingham objections and the residents' objections, it would have been good for us to go and see for ourselves. But so anyway, I'm just indicating that I'm not being totally negative. I'm saying I see a different way forward here. My reasons for voting against this are, first of all, the points that have already been raised. I think that this is too far out of Mere for services. I think the pedestrian access to services in Mere it's even further than I had previously understood it to be. I gather it's more than 2 miles. Along a country lane with no pavement and the officer conceded bends. So the first point, I think the pedestrian access is clearly not safe for children, and there are going to be several children on this site. The second point is that there clearly is an adverse impact on the amenity of neighbours. We've heard that from the neighbours, and they've given us particular details of the adverse impacts that they are going to experience. And then my third point is that I do think that the landscape officer has gone wrong here, because essentially you look at the comments of the landscape officer, and what he is doing is saying that he's supporting this because it's an improvement on the existing situation. Now, the landscape officer does seem to have forgotten that this is a special landscape area. That's not a national designation, it's a local designation, but in designating special landscape areas, Wiltshire County Council took the view that these were areas of special landscape that needed to be preserved as special landscape areas. And clearly, if the message is to go out that any special landscape area is only special for non-traveller and gypsy development, but it's open to traveller and gypsy development, I do sense that a lot of landowners in special landscape areas, and I'm thinking of a couple in particular, one north of Dilton Marsh, another one east of Westbury. I mean, I could go on. There are lots of special landscape areas around it. The message will go out that the way forward to turn your land from agricultural land worth a few thousand an acre into development land worth 10 or 20 times as much is to put some derelict old vehicles and buildings and sort of bits of scrap iron dotted around it, and then wait a few years and put in an application for traveller and gypsy accommodation. So I do think the landscape officer has gone seriously wrong here. And clearly, one of the speakers in the open forum told us about a prosecution over the state of the land. And if Wiltshire Council were firing on all 12 cylinders over this, it does seem to me that rather than comparing the existing situation with the future, what is proposed, we should be comparing the agricultural state of the land with what is proposed, particularly in view of what the local member has told us about the local landscape. So there you are, Chairman. I'm going to vote against this. And if the motion for permission goes down, I will try to catch your eye to move a site visit so that we can see it for ourselves.
Good points, well made, Christopher. Thank you. Tony, hang on just a minute. I'll just come back to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I should have suggested, I had forgotten that it fits the criteria of Core Policy 47, you know.
Right, okay, yeah. Councillor Britton, Richard.
Thank you, Chairman. I shan't be supporting the motion either. This is a very open site, as we can see very clearly from the picture. Whatever boundary treatment is agreed would be an alien feature in itself. So far from disguising the site, it would draw attention to it. I think there would be quite clearly an adverse impact on open countryside, which would be unacceptable. I think also the site can't be considered sustainable, bearing in mind the details we've heard about the nature of the route from the site into Mere. It's a twisty-turny site, no footpaths, narrow lanes. That's not usable by pedestrians, not safely anyway. So I don't think the site can genuinely be considered sustainable in the context of the policy guidelines. So for those two main reasons, I shan't support the motion.
Thank you, Councillor Britton. Adrian, Councillor Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I take on Councillor Britton's views and I take on Chris's, and I don't disagree with many of the things that have been said there or by the people who have spoken today. And as Chris has very quite rightly mentioned, that not having a policy puts us in a different position to where we might otherwise have been when making decisions. I'm just concerned that my one concern with this particular site was that it is very dense, you know, compared to other sites that have come forward to us. It doesn't have a recreational area for the children to play in. It doesn't have, you know, an area for animals and things like that. It is purely for the buildings themselves, and therefore it is limited in its scope compared to what we usually see. Having been brought up in a rural situation almost identical to this, I don't buy the argument about the rural walking, because that would mean that in my childhood I would never have been able to visit the village because the council didn't think it appropriate for me to walk along a country lane or a public footpath across fields and get my feet muddy. And that would have limited and restricted my upbringing quite considerably, and I can't endorse that approach. I am concerned when Tony rightly says Core Policy 47 is important here and that it meets it. But Core Policy 47 at 6.67 states residential development will not normally be permitted in the countryside unless it meets the requirements of Core Policy 44. Rural exception sites, however, additional dwellings may be justified in circumstances where they are required in the interest of supporting rural employment, for example, in association with the equestrian activities, which is what happened with the previous site, and I suspect why it got approval, even though they've never been put up. Activities when worker accommodation is needed on site, in view of the exceptional circumstances, application will be scrutinised thoroughly, and opportunities for accommodation within the nearby settlements must be considered initially. This application doesn't meet that requirement. So therefore, to say it meets Core Policy 47 is a concern. I will be supporting the application purely and simply because we don't have a policy. And we must provide accommodation for gypsies and travellers. And that has to be our priority. But the fact that we're not going to be able to choose where they are is of great concern. But I agree with a lot of what's been said.
Thank you. Councillor Gibson. Sarah.
I just wanted to pick up on a point that was made earlier when you were looking for the areas of the Core Policy 47. And one of the, going back to my point about electricity and such like, Core Policy 47.3 does say that the site can be properly serviced and is supplied with essential services such as water, power, sewerage and drainage and waste disposal. And whilst I accept the idea that there are people who wish to be off the grid, the intention of that is usually for sustainable reasons, not because they are so far away from any possibility. But this is specific to Core Policy 47. So the assumption is that these sites would be within the range and be supplied with what is considered to be essential services, including power. And the idea that we are going to have sites in the open countryside, which is by its nature quiet, serviced by any constant and only form of power being generators, strikes me as extremely worrying. Because if that is a precedent, then we're into a completely different idea of what we see these sites being. And I can't help but agreeing with Councillor Foster and the others that this is not the appropriate site, and we are being, to a certain extent, pushed into this in exactly the same way as we often feel we are with large development sites, on the grounds that we're lacking the provision that we are supposed to have and have done since I've been on this council, which is hugely worrying. I'm still debating whether I follow Councillor Foster or not and saying that we have to accept it.
I'll come back to you in a minute, Christopher. Linda, did you want to come back on that one?
Yes, Councillor, I can understand your concerns on that, but it says power, it doesn't say electricity. It's specifically, I think, giving the options open to how that power is supplied. And it says...
No, I'm sorry, a supply of power does not imply that you bring a generation. That's not a supply of power. That is you bringing your own power. That's not what it's...
We'll have to possibly agree to disagree on that. But again, if you look through appeal decisions we've had based on our policy, inspectors have allowed much more remote proposals than this one, with less services in areas of flood risk, based largely on the fact that you don't have a 5-year supply. And there's nothing to say that the applicant doesn't intend to put in an electricity supply. It's not a discussion we've had. We're assuming he's going to work on generators, but I can see him nodding in the back saying he's not going to use generators, he wants electricity supply. So we can't make I would suggest you can't make a decision based on what you think might happen, because we haven't had that discussion yet with the applicant. Very often because with an application of this type, which is criteria based, they don't want to do a heck of a lot of work in advance of not knowing whether you're going to get permission or not, which is why we put a lot of conditions on to deal with that at a later stage. But I would suggest that generators are not a suggested means of a supply for this site.
Thank you for that, Linda. Christopher, you want to
So, well, I was just going to make the quick point that the inspector's decision letters do not say that the absence of allocated sites means that that everything goes through. They do say we have to look at Core Policy 47, and they go through them point by point. And the Hull Martin inspector in particular said that he could only find one point of Core Policy 47 that wasn't complied with, and that was the flooding, and that it was possible to condition it in such a way that the people living on site would not suffer from flooding. And so he clearly, anyway, I'll leave it there. I don't think officers have said that the absence of allocated sites means that Core Policy 47 is not relevant. Indeed, the report is mostly about compliance with Core Policy 47.
Thank you. Philip, I'm going to break the protocol slightly. There was a bit of sign language going on between you and the case officer. Was there something you wanted to come forward to, a bit of clarification on the power?
Yes. Firstly, the site is already connected to mains water and arrangements are already being made to connect the site to mains electricity.
Okay, thank you. I exceptionally asked for that to come forward, but sorry? Okay, well, as I've done one, I'll do the other. Go on then.
Can you use the microphone, sorry?
There's a lot of silage traffic that goes up and down that road with tractors, and it is also a back route to the new Hillbrush development, and there was a lot of car traffic as well. And that's
That wasn't the issue I wanted fleshed out, but thank you for that. Any more members have anything more they wanted to say? In which case, I'm going to go to the vote then. Now, we might have to have some clarification over what's being conditioned and where the informators are here. So, Linda got her paperwork together. So the motion which has been seconded is to support the recommendation of the officer with the deletion of parking space.
It's the deletion of the words parking of vehicles in condition 17.
I thought there was something else that came forward as well.
It could be a condition, but I'd have to have some advice on that, is mitigating any noise from the use of generators.
Now, that's important. We have had that before. And I think the suggestion was the generator should be in some kind of
condition
enclosure.
rather than informative on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that would
It would need to
pass
be a
the-
condition, wouldn't it?
Sorry?
I'm saying it would need to be a condition, not an informative.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Yep, I've got that written down, that we, generators to be in a building if they're going to be used, and then the additional informative note relating to electric charging points.
If the generator's in a building, that would mean planning permission for that building?
Yes, because they've taken away, one of the conditions takes away all permitted development rights for additional buildings.
Sarah?
That would seem only fair then, rather than specifying that the generator needs to be in a building, one could merely specify that it doesn't produce more than a certain number of decibels. There is a general building regs thing to do with noise, which I can look up, but that would make it fair, because there are generators that are almost entirely quiet because they're self. So that would be fairer than asking them to go for planning permission, I would have thought.
I think if you want to do that, I would really need to talk to public protection, because decibel levels are very different depending on the setting. So in an urban area, it will be different than a rural area, and I wouldn't want to set it too high or too low. So if you do want to add that condition, I think, could you defer that back to myself to talk to environmental health to get a level that is suitable for the location? Because I don't want to come up with one off the top of my head, if that's
No, that would be for Tony to accept as the mover of the motion.
Yeah, I think if we delegate that to the officer, without a doubt. Oh, if our seconder behind me would accept that.
You happy to
James?
second that?
Yeah. I think we must get that right, so.
Yeah, sure.
Can I just read it? So just for the benefit of the people on the live stream, so where the motion is to for the officer recommendation, so with the deletion of the word parking in condition 17, and then mitigating the noise of the generator by the decibel level, but wording would be delegated to the officer, and then an informative on EV charging points. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you.
So all in favour of that motion, please show.
8 in favour,
And against?
3 against. So the motion is passed and the application is approved.
Thank you very much indeed. So you've heard that the motion is passed, the application is approved. albeit with those conditions and informatives attached. I would like to thank you all for your attendance this afternoon. Do appreciate that, and wish you safe journeys home. I'd just like to ask members of the public if you could leave quietly now, because we do have a training session to go into. I'll give you a few minutes to leave, and for members to have a comfort break if they so wish. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your time.